first book that we're reading this semester is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. I'm very excited for this one. It generally turns out to be pretty much everyone's favorite thing that we read in this class. I will ask that if you already have seen it or if you know about it, please don't spoil it for your peers because it's a really, really cool book, and I would like us to enjoy it together without it being ruined. So these are just going to give us a background on John Steinbeck and kind of confirm some of the stuff you researched about the time period, as well as letting you know a little bit more about what this book is going to be like. So, John Steinbeck, he was born in 1902 in Salinas, California. He was the third of 4 children and the only son. And he loved growing up in the Salinas countryside. He would very much become inspiration for him later on in his writing. And he also, while he was in Salinas and growing up, worked his summers as a hired hand in nearby ranches. So that is a big part of the inspiration for the setting of this book. So here's some pictures from that time period in the fields of Salinas, California. You can see the mountains in the background. It is very beautiful, and you can see that, remember, in this time we didn't have the technology that we have today, so everything was being done by hand. So you see they have their buckets, and they have their trucks, and they have to go and hand pick everything. So by the age of 14, he decided that he wanted to be a writer. He did really well in English, and he did go to college to make his parents happy, but he only took like random courses of stuff that he thought was interesting. So he didn't really end up receiving a degree because he didn't like work towards one specific thing. And he tended to drop in and out of school because he liked to go work places or take a break. And a lot of times he would work with migrant workers back on these California ranches because that's something that made him happy. So in the 20s and 30s, he concentrated on writings and wrote several books that were all set in California. And he was lucky. A lot of writers don't get famous until after their death, but he was very famous during his life as well. So these are some of the books that he wrote that were very famous. He died in 1968 at his apartment, and he was buried back in Salinas County. And his experiences in the fields with these migrant workers led him to really care about these people and see their problems and want justice for them and want them to have a better life and be more well known. And that's part of why he chose to write about them. So his writing style, he writes very much in, he writes a lot of dialogue, so it's almost like a play, and then he'll have like short passages that like describe, so he'll like describe a place, and then he'll have like people talking to each other. So a lot of stuff is explained through these conversations that they have instead of him just telling you. And because of this style, his stuff was really easy to make into films or plays. So our book that we're reading, Of Mice and Men, originally it was called Something That Happened, which is a little more vague. And originally, when he first started writing it, he wanted for it to be for children. He wanted it to be for kids. It didn't end up that way, but I think that's why it's a little easier to read. So he wrote a manuscript in 1936, but his new puppy that he had at the time ended up eating the manuscript, chewing it up and ripping it up. So his manuscript, the book, wasn't published until 1937 because he had to like rewrite it basically. And he said of the book that it's an experiment and I don't know how successful, although it's still one of the most read books in the world today, so I would say probably pretty successful. It is a novella, and this is a term that I want you to know. A novella is shorter than a novel, but longer than a short story. So it's like a short book, basically. It's only 6 chapters. It's really tiny. It's easy to get through. And again, he was very lucky to have fame during his life. He got to go on a big book tour into Europe after Mice and Men was published. He also found great success with The Grapes of Wrath, and it was also based on his experience with migrant workers. So the issues that are addressed in the novel are the ones that Steinbeck really, really cared about during his life and why he spent so much time on these farms. Poverty, homelessness, migrant workers being exploited and used because they don't really have anything else that they can do, the failure of the American dream, and then America's general decline in morality. And remember, morals is like being able to decipher what's right and what's wrong, or being a good person in general. So, again, before we had machinery, everything on the farm had to be done by hand, basically. So, thousands of people would go travel to the countryside to get work, and they would kind of migrate around to wherever was being farmed at that time. That's where they would go. They would work on that farm, they would get their money, and then they would go somewhere else. So they would harvest whatever it was, grapes, barley, wheat, rye, whatever it happens to be. They earned $2 to $3 a day, plus food and shelter. They usually lived on the farm and were fed by the farm. And in the 1930s, there was so much unemployment in America that there were these agencies where you can go and they would basically like have a bunch of contacts of places that needed workers, and so the agencies you could go to this agency and they would send you to a place that had requested help. So like in the novel, George and Lennie, they'll say that they have like these work cards from Murray and Reddy's, and that was one of the work agencies that would send them out. It's set in the farmland of the Salinas Valley, so remember that is where John Steinbeck was born. It's a real place. It's near Soledad, so you can see, like on our map here, here's Salinas, here's the Salinas Valley. And the countryside, as described at the beginning of the novel, and the ranch itself, all of it is based on Steinbeck's real-life experiences. It's all based on real life. It's not a true story, but it's based in truth. Here's some more pictures of the beautiful countryside. And then here's some of what it might have looked like back in the 1930s. So you can see, like, here's some advertising for the vegetables that they would be growing. Here's kind of like cars were kind of starting to be a thing. Highways were starting to be a thing, but they weren't, not everybody could afford it. Things like that. So Steinbeck focuses on people who are kind of oppressed. So the poor, the racial minorities, people who are misfits and don't fit in and are treated badly by society. And they're often really hardworking and good-hearted, but they have a lot of issues as well. They tend to drink, they tend to argue, they're in a bad situation. Rural heroes who are illiterate and sometimes weak, but nevertheless noble. So maybe they're not the smartest people, maybe they're not, going places, but they're still good people. And he says that the profanity of his characters, which is not bad at all, especially compared to The Hate U Give, it contributes to their reality and why they're understandable. And I think that his characters are really relatable. Our main characters is going to be Lennie and George. This is Lennie, and this is George. So Lennie is this very big but childlike migrant worker. So he has a mental disability, and he depends on George to kind of help him through. So they kind of have this dream of having a farm together, and he just kind of does what George tells him to and helps him out. Lennie doesn't really understand his own strength, but he loves petting soft things, and because of his mental disability, sometimes he gets in trouble for it. And then George, the other half of our duo, he is quick-witted, he's small, he cares for Lennie, but he's grumpy about it. He often berates Lennie and tells him that his life would be easier without him, but he loves him nonetheless. And he eventually wants to also have that farm of their dreams. He's always kind of scheming and looking for that next big thing to hope that, eventually they'll make it. Themes that we're going to be looking at: friendship and dreams, not just like dreams like you're asleep, but like goals in life and aspirations. The possibility or impossibility of the American dream, loneliness and loyalty, oppression and lack of power, nature and fate. These are all really important things that we'll be talking about in the book. And when I say dreams again, like they have this dream to own their own ranch and be able to live off the fat of the land and be their own bosses, basically. I've mentioned the American dream several times. I want you guys to kind of think about it, and we'll go over it again in class later on. But the American dream in general is that, like, if you work hard enough and you're a good enough person, you can have whatever you want and you'll get whatever you want. And it's something that drew a lot of people to America because it was a land of freedom, a land of opportunity, a land of equality. But I think a lot of people who ended up coming to America to pursue that dream and to try and escape persecution and try and get a better life for their families, especially after some really terrible things happening or beginning to happen in Europe. They came to America, but they found that this dream that they had been sold was not really going to happen. There was slavery had just ended, but there was still racism and Jim Crow. The Civil War left a lot of deep hatred in the country. There were slums that were just as bad as those ones in Europe, and there was a lot of corruption in the American political system, which led to a lot of them not being able to pursue things that they wanted to pursue. Then, of course, in 1929, the Wall Street market crashed and started the Great Depression. So, a lot of people had to give up everything they owned. A lot of people lost everything and had to migrate and try and a lot of farms, due to the Dust Bowl and stuff, ended due to drought. So they lost everything as well. So some people still were able to follow their dreams, but most people had big struggles during this time. So hopefully you learned some of this during your research. It was the biggest downturn in American history. Began with a stock market crash and lasted until we got into World War II, in which case we were able to kind of get our economy back going. Unemployment was up to 30%. 50% of banks failed, which means people who had money in those banks lost everything. Crop prices fell because people couldn't afford to buy food, so they weren't, and so this means that farms were not doing well and farmers were not making money. Overproduction led to unemployment because we're making too much of something, and so now we don't need to make it anymore, so we're just going to shut down the factory. Millions of Americans had their homes and lives destroyed during this time. So this is a picture of them trying to get their money out of banks. They're all the way out to the walls. They're just trying to get their money before the bank has to close. Here's some people. They ended up probably living in their car. Everything they own is in this truck. They don't have a home. They don't have much. There were these tent cities of people who were basically homeless, and so they had to basically live in a tent. And they became you can see how far back it goes. There's whole cities of them, these people living in tents. This is one of the most famous pictures of the Great Depression. This mother with her children, she kind of was like, what am I going to do? Now this is a couple of migrant workers, and this will be very much like our main characters. You can see that he has his bindle bag. He has all of his stuff rolled up in a sleeping bag on his back. They carried everything they owned with them. They didn't have a home, and they often had to move around. Here's an example of the Dust Bowl. Over farming led to this horrible dusty conditions where things were just covered in sand and dust and grit, and killed the crops, killed all the wildlife. It was horrible. Here's another example of them living in their car, and they've kind of turned it into part of this tent so that they have a little more shelter. And again, these migrant workers, so here's another bindlestiff, which is what they were called. And then here's kind of like what you would get if you were a migrant worker. So you would have your one bed, you could hang some stuff on the wall, you might have like some blankets or something, and then like there was usually like a trunk for your stuff, and that's it. That's your little slice of what you get. So the title's origin comes from a poem named Mice and Men, and I'm not going to go too much into this because we're going to actually read that poem later. And that's it. So I hope that kind of got you interested. I'm very, very excited for this book again, and I'm excited to get started.